At my son's 9th birthday party, my sister-in-law told him, "You'll be in prison by 18 without a father to guide you." My son Jamie was opening presents when Melissa said it loud enough for everyone at Chuck E. Cheese to hear. 20 kids and their parents all turned to stare at us. Jamie's face went white and he stopped mid-tear on the wrapping paper for his new skateboard. "What did you just say to my son?" I stood up from the party table, knocking over a cup of soda, but I didn't care. Melissa adjusted her designer purse and repeated herself slower like I was stupid. "I'm just being realistic. Boys without fathers end up in jail. That's statistics. My Aiden has his dad to teach him right from wrong. Jamie only has you." She said it like she was discussing the weather, not destroying a 9-year-old's birthday. Her son Aiden sat next to Jamie, smirking because he'd heard this poison before. My husband died in Afghanistan 3 years ago, serving his country, while Melissa's husband Paul sold insurance and coached Little League. But according to her, that made Aiden superior to my son. "Aunt Melissa says kids like you steal stuff," Aiden announced to the table. "My dad says your mom can't raise you right because women need men to handle boys." Jamie's friends looked uncomfortable, and some parents were already gathering their kids to leave. The party I'd saved for months to throw was ruined in less than 2 minutes. "Get out." I pointed to the door, but Melissa laughed. "You can't kick me out. I'm family. Besides, Paul paid for half this party, remember? You begged us for help because you couldn't afford it yourself." She was lying. I'd never asked them for money. They'd insisted on contributing, then held it over my head every chance they got. "You said you wanted to help celebrate Jamie's birthday." I tried to keep my voice steady, but my hands were shaking with rage. "We are helping. Someone needs to prepare him for reality. Do you know what percentage of fatherless boys end up in the system? 70%. That's basically guaranteed." She pulled out her phone like she was going to Google statistics at my son's birthday party. Jamie was crying now and his friends were whispering. One kid asked his mom if Jamie was going to become a criminal. The mom grabbed her son and left without saying goodbye. Others followed. Within 10 minutes, half the party was gone. "Look what you did." Melissa gestured at the empty seats. "This is what happens when you can't control your emotions. No wonder Jamie doesn't have a male role model. You probably scared them all away with your hysteria." Her husband Paul walked over from the arcade with their younger son Brett. "What's going on? Why is everyone leaving?" He looked around confused at the emptying party room. "Your sister is having another breakdown." Melissa rolled her eyes. "I simply told Jamie the truth about his future and she went crazy. This is why boys need fathers, to see how real men handle situations, without all the drama." Paul didn't even defend me. He just shrugged and said, "Maybe we should go." But Melissa wasn't done. "We'll take Aiden and Brett home, but I think you should consider what I said. Jamie needs structure. Real discipline. Maybe he should spend weekends with us where he can see how a proper family functions." She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she was some saint offering to save my son from me. A proper family? I couldn't hold back anymore. "You mean like when Paul got fired for drinking at work? Or when you maxed out 3 credit cards buying purses? That kind of proper family?" Melissa's face turned red, but she recovered quickly. "At least we're together. At least Aiden knows his father is coming home every night, not like Jamie waiting for a ghost who's never coming back." That's when Jamie threw his cake. Not at her, but at the wall. Purple frosting exploded everywhere. He stood up on his chair and screamed, "My dad was a hero. He died fighting bad guys. Your husband sells paper and coaches baseball. My dad saved people's lives." His voice cracked, but he kept going. "And I'm not going to jail. I'm going to be a soldier like him, or a doctor, or a teacher. I'm going to be something good. And you're just jealous because Aiden is mean and stupid and nobody likes him." Aiden started crying because it was true. The kid bullied everyone at school and only had friends because Paul bribed their parents with baseball tickets. "How dare you?" But the remaining parents at the party weren't looking at Jamie with judgment. They were looking at Melissa with disgust. One mom came over and put her hand on my shoulder. "Your son is absolutely right. His father was a hero. And you're doing an amazing job raising him alone." She turned to Melissa. "What kind of person tells a child they'll end up in prison at their birthday party? What's wrong with you?" Melissa finally left with her family, and I grabbed paper towels from the counter to clean the purple frosting off the wall. The manager came over and said not to worry about it, that he saw what happened and understood completely. I scrubbed anyway because I needed something to do with my hands besides shaking. The other parents gathered their kids and left quickly, avoiding eye contact like they didn't want to get involved in family drama. Jamie sat in the car in the parking lot with his seatbelt already on, staring straight ahead through the windshield. One mom stayed behind, though. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and wore jeans and a sweater, nothing fancy. She started picking up the unopened presents from the table and stacking them carefully in a pile. I didn't even know her name, but she was helping me when everyone else had run away. She looked at me while holding a gift wrapped in dinosaur paper and said her son. Thought Jamie was the bravest kid in their class. Her voice was quiet but firm. She told me what Melissa said was absolutely disgusting, and that no child should ever hear words like that, especially at their own birthday party. I felt tears starting but blinked them back because I'd already cried enough in front of strangers today. She introduced herself as Michaela Barnes and said her son sat next to Jamie in class. We carried the presents out to my car together and she helped me fit them in the trunk around the bags of party favors I'd spent 2 weeks putting together. Jamie didn't turn around or acknowledge us loading the gifts. Michaela pulled out her phone and asked for my number. She typed it in and then told me her husband was a family therapist who worked with kids. She said if Jamie needed someone to talk to about what happened, her husband could probably help, or at least recommend someone good. I thanked her and my voice cracked on the words. She squeezed my shoulder and said I was doing an amazing job raising Jamie alone, and that anyone with eyes could see how much I loved my son. She walked to her car where her own son waited, and I got in the driver's seat. Jamie still hadn't moved or spoken. I started the engine and drove home in complete silence. He stared out the window the whole 15 minutes, and I didn't know what to say to make any of this better. That night I made his favorite dinner, spaghetti with the sauce he liked from the jar with the vegetables hidden in it. He sat at the kitchen table and pushed the noodles around his plate with his fork. He took 2 bites in 20 minutes. I asked if he wanted to open his presents, and he shook his head no. I asked if he wanted to watch a movie, and he said he was tired. It was only 7 o'clock, but he got up from the table and went to his room. I heard his door close, and then nothing. I cleaned up the dinner neither of us had eaten and put the leftovers in containers for lunches. Around 8, I walked down the hallway and stood outside his door. I could hear him crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet sounds like he was trying to muffle them in his pillow. I knocked softly and asked if I could come in. He said he wanted to be alone. I pressed my hand against the door and told him I loved him. He didn't answer. I went back to the kitchen and sat at the table staring at my phone. I wanted to call someone but didn't know who. My mom lived 2 states away. My best friend from college had moved to California. The other military widows I knew from the support group I went to twice had their own problems. I opened Facebook and saw 3 notifications. 2 parents from the party had unfriended me. The third was a message from someone asking what happened at Chuck E. Cheese because their kid came home talking about it. I closed the app and put my phone face down on the table. I went to bed at 10 but couldn't sleep. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling fan going around and around. Melissa's. Words kept playing in my head on repeat. Boys without fathers end up in jail. 70%. I wondered if she was right. I wondered if I was failing Jamie by raising him alone. I worked full-time as a receptionist at a dental office and barely made enough to cover rent and groceries. I couldn't afford the nice house in the good school district that Melissa had. I couldn't take Jamie on vacations or buy him expensive birthday presents. His dad would have taught him things I couldn't teach him. How to throw a football properly. How to fix things around the house. How to be a man, whatever that meant. I rolled over and looked at the picture on my nightstand of my husband in his uniform. He'd been gone 3 years, but sometimes it felt like yesterday, and sometimes it felt like forever. I thought about what kind of father he would have been if he'd lived. Patient, probably. Funny. Good at building things. Jamie barely remembered him now. He was only 6 when it happened. I grabbed my pillow and pressed it over my face because I didn't want Jamie to hear me crying too. The self-doubt crept in like poison, spreading through my thoughts. Maybe Melissa was right about statistics. Maybe single mothers couldn't raise boys properly. Maybe Jamie needed a father figure, and I was selfish for not remarrying, or at least dating someone who could fill that role. I knew her comments were cruel and unfair, but part of me wondered if there was truth buried in the cruelty. The next morning, Jamie came into the kitchen while I was making scrambled eggs. He climbed onto the chair at the table and sat with his hands folded in his lap. His eyes were red and puffy. He asked me if what Aunt Melissa said was true. He asked if kids without dads really ended up in jail. My heart broke into pieces hearing him say those words. I turned off the stove and walked over to him. I pulled him close and wrapped my arms around him tight. I told him that was absolutely not true. I told him plenty of amazing people were raised by single parents and they turned out wonderful. I said his dad would be so proud of the person he was becoming, that he was kind and smart and brave. I told him Aunt Melissa was wrong and mean, and that what she said had nothing to do with him and everything to do with her own problems. He asked why she would say something like that if it wasn't true. I said sometimes people say hurtful things when they're unhappy with their own lives. He buried his face in my shirt, and I felt it get wet with his tears. We stayed like that for a long time until the eggs got cold on the stove. I heated them up again and we ate breakfast together. He seemed a little better after our talk, but I could tell he was still carrying Melissa's words around with him like weights. After I dropped Jamie at the school, I sat in the parking lot and called my mom. She answered on the second ring asking how the party went. I told her everything that happened. I told her what Melissa said to Jamie in front of everyone. I told her about the cake hitting the wall and the parents leaving and Jamie crying in his room. My mom was furious. Her voice got loud and sharp in a way I rarely heard. She said she was going to call Melissa immediately and tell her exactly how inappropriate her behavior was. She said what kind of person tells a 9-year-old child they're destined for prison at their birthday party. She said Melissa had always been judgmental and critical, but this crossed every line. I felt relieved having someone on my side who understood how terrible this was. My mom said she'd call me back after she talked to Melissa. I drove to work and tried to focus on scheduling appointments and answering phones, but my mind kept wandering back to Jamie sitting alone in his classroom. My mom called back during my lunch break. She sounded frustrated and angry. She said Melissa refused to apologize and claimed she was just being honest about statistics. Melissa told my mom that I was too emotional and sensitive to handle constructive criticism about my parenting. My mom said she told Melissa that criticizing someone's parenting at their child's birthday party wasn't constructive. It was cruel. Melissa apparently said that someone needed to prepare Jamie for reality, and that I was living in denial about the challenges of raising a boy without a father. My mom said she told Melissa she was never welcome in her house again after treating her grandson like that. Melissa said fine, that. She had better things to do than deal with our family drama anyway. My mom apologized for not being able to get through to her. I told her it wasn't her fault and thanked her for trying. We talked for a few more minutes about maybe me and Jamie coming to visit soon. After we hung up, I felt both supported and defeated at the same time. That afternoon, I got a text from Paul. It was long and said that Melissa felt attacked by everyone and that I overreacted by making a scene at the party. He said they were just trying to help and that I should appreciate their concern instead of getting defensive. He wrote that they wouldn't be contributing to any future events if I was going to be so ungrateful for their help. I read the text 3 times, feeling my anger build with each word. They were making themselves the victims. They were acting like I was the problem for being upset that someone told my son he'd end up in prison. I wanted to text back something angry, but instead I took a screenshot of the message. I saved it to a folder on my phone. I realized I needed to document everything in case the situation got worse. I didn't know what worse would look like, but I had a feeling this wasn't over. A few minutes later, Michaela texted asking how Jamie was doing. I told her he was struggling, but we were working through it. She suggested getting the boys together for a playdate this weekend, said it might help Jamie to spend time with a friend who saw what happened, and knew it wasn't his fault. I agreed and we made plans for Saturday afternoon. Monday morning, Jamie got ready for school slower than usual. He didn't want to go. I asked why, and he said he didn't want to see anyone. I told him he couldn't miss school because of what happened at the party. He got in the car without arguing, but I could see the dread on his face. When I picked him up that afternoon, he climbed in the back seat and slammed the door. His face was red and his jaw was clenched. I asked what was wrong. He said Aiden told everyone in their class that Jamie was going to be a criminal when he grew up. He said Aiden announced it during morning circle time when they were supposed to share weekend news. The teacher overheard and separated them to opposite sides of the classroom, but the damage was done. All the kids were whispering about it at recess. One girl asked Jamie if he was going to rob a bank. Another kid asked if he'd been arrested before. Jamie said he wanted to punch Aiden in the face but didn't because he'd get in trouble. He was humiliated and angry, and I didn't know how to fix it. I told him I was proud of him for not hitting Aiden even though he wanted to. I said I would email his teacher tonight and figure out how to handle this. He stared out the window and didn't respond. When we got home, he went straight to his room again and I heard him throw something against the wall. I sat at my laptop that night after Jamie finally fell asleep and opened my email. My hands shook as I typed out a message to his teacher explaining what happened at the party and how Aiden was now spreading lies about Jamie at the school. I asked her to watch for any bullying behavior and pressed send before I could second-guess myself. The response came back in less than 10 minutes. She said she'd already noticed tension between the boys over the past few weeks and wanted to schedule a meeting with me as soon as possible. We set it up for Wednesday afternoon right after school let out. Wednesday came and I sat across from Jamie's teacher in her classroom while kids shouted and played outside on the playground. She pulled out a folder with Jamie's name on it and told me Aiden had been making mean comments about Jamie not having a dad for weeks now. She'd overheard him telling other kids that Jamie's mom couldn't control him and that boys without fathers always got in trouble. The teacher looked worried as she explained the pattern she'd noticed and said she thought the school counselor should get involved. I felt sick knowing this had been going on longer than I realized and that Jamie hadn't told me about it. The teacher walked me down to the counselor's office and introduced me to Juliet O'Reilly. She had warm brown eyes and a calm voice that immediately made me feel less panicked about the whole situation. Juliet shook my hand and then crouched down to Jamie's level when he walked in from class. She told him they were going to have a chat and asked if that was okay with him. He nodded and followed her into her office while I sat in the waiting area trying not to imagine what he was telling her. 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. When the door finally opened, Jamie walked out looking somehow lighter than when he went in. His shoulders weren't hunched up near his ears anymore, and he actually made eye contact with me. Juliet asked if she could speak with me privately for a moment and led me into her office while Jamie waited outside. She sat down across from me and explained that Jamie was carrying a lot of grief about his father that he hadn't fully processed. The party incident had triggered deeper fears about being different from other kids and not fitting in anywhere. She recommended weekly sessions with her and handed me a stack of resources specifically for children of military families. I took the papers with shaking hands and thanked her for helping him. She squeezed my shoulder and told me I was doing a good job and that Jamie would be okay with the right support. My phone rang Friday evening while I was making dinner. Melissa's name flashed on the screen and I almost didn't answer. I picked up on the 4th ring and she immediately started talking without saying hello. She demanded I stop telling people she was a bad person and accused me of spreading lies about her to the whole family. Apparently, my mom had been calling other relatives about what happened at the party, and now everyone was asking Melissa questions. Her voice got louder as she talked and I could hear the anger underneath every word. I set down the knife I'd been using to cut vegetables and took a breath before responding. I told Melissa calmly that I hadn't been spreading stories about her to anyone. Her behavior at the party was witnessed by 20 families who drew their own conclusions about what kind of person says those things to a child. She cut me off and accused me of turning people against her on purpose. She said I was being vindictive and trying to destroy her reputation because I couldn't handle the truth about single parenting. I felt my jaw clench as she kept talking, but I forced myself to stay calm. She wasn't going to make me lose control again. Melissa's voice changed then and got quieter, but somehow more threatening. She said she'd been talking to Paul about getting a lawyer involved. She claimed that keeping Aiden away from Jamie was harmful to their cousin relationship, and that she might have grounds for grandparent visitation rights. I almost laughed at that. I pointed out that she wasn't Jamie's grandparent and had absolutely no legal standing to demand anything. She sputtered for a second before hanging up on me. I stood there holding my phone and feeling my heart race in my chest. The next morning, I looked up free legal aid clinics in our area and called the first one that answered. A lawyer named Rebecca listened to my whole story and then assured me that as Jamie's parent, I could set whatever boundaries I needed to protect his well-being. She explained that Melissa had no legal rights to see Jamie and that her threats were empty. Rebecca told me to document everything, including the party incident and any future contact attempts. I felt relief wash over me as I thanked her and hung up. At least I knew where I stood legally, even if Melissa tried to cause more problems. Jamie had his first official counseling session with Juliet on Tuesday after school. I dropped him off and went to wait in my car because the waiting room felt too small and stuffy. When he came out 40 minutes later, he climbed into the back seat and buckled his seatbelt without me having to remind him. He said he told Juliet about missing his dad and about what Aunt Melissa said at the party. He seemed relieved to have someone outside the family to talk to about everything. I asked if it helped, and he nodded while looking out the window. He said Juliet understood and didn't make him feel weird about being sad. Thursday evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Michaela inviting Jamie and me to dinner at her house on Saturday. She said her kids had been asking about Jamie, and she thought it might be good for him to spend time with friends who saw what happened at the party. I texted back yes and felt grateful that at least one good thing had come out of that awful day. Saturday came and we drove to Michaela's house in a neighborhood nicer than ours with big trees lining the streets. Her kids ran out to greet us and pulled Jamie inside to show him their new puppy. I watched him laugh and play with them in the backyard and felt something loosen in my chest. He was still just a regular 9-year-old who needed normal childhood experiences. He wasn't broken or damaged, no matter what Melissa had said. Michaela's husband brought over coffee while the kids played in the backyard with the puppy. He sat down across from me at their kitchen table and said, "Parents who throw around statistics about single-parent families are usually dealing with their own problems." He explained that in his therapy practice, he sees couples who focus on other people's parenting to avoid looking at their own marriages. His words made something click in my head, because Melissa had always been quick to point out flaws in everyone else, while her own life was far from perfect. He said people who feel secure in their choices don't need to tear down others to feel good about themselves. I thanked him for saying that, and felt lighter somehow knowing Melissa's cruelty said more about her than it did about me or Jamie. Monday morning, my phone rang while I was making Jamie's lunch for school. The principal's voice on the other end was calm, but serious as she told me there had been an incident on the playground during recess. Aiden had pushed Jamie hard enough to knock him down, and then stood over him, calling him a future criminal in front of other kids. My stomach dropped, and I asked if Jamie was hurt. She said he had scraped his knee but was more upset emotionally than physically. Both boys were sitting in her office right now, and she wanted to schedule a meeting with both families together. I felt my hands start shaking as I held the phone because I knew this meant facing Melissa again. I told the principal I would agree to meet, but only if she stayed in the room as a mediator. I wasn't going to let Melissa turn this into another attack on my parenting without someone official there to witness it. The principal said that was completely reasonable, and she would be documenting everything discussed in the meeting. She scheduled it for the following week and said she'd send both families a formal notice about the meeting time and expectations for behavior. I hung up and sat down at the kitchen table feeling exhausted, even though it was only 8 in the morning. Jamie came downstairs ready for school, and I could see the scrape on his knee through his torn jeans. He didn't mention the playground incident, and I decided not to bring it up until after school, when we could talk about it properly. The following week, I walked into the principal's office and found Melissa already sitting there in a navy blue suit like she was heading to court. Paul sat next to her looking uncomfortable in khakis and a button-down shirt. The principal gestured for me to sit across from them and started the meeting by explaining that bullying of any kind was unacceptable at their school. She said Aiden's behavior had crossed clear lines and that the school took physical aggression and verbal harassment very seriously. She pulled out a folder with incident reports and witness statements from other students who had seen what happened on the playground. Melissa immediately jumped in to defend Aiden before the principal could continue. She said he was just repeating things he'd heard adults say, and that kids needed to learn about real-world consequences. She claimed that shielding children from hard truths did them a disservice in the long run. The principal held up her hand to stop Melissa mid-sentence and said teaching children that their classmates were destined for prison was not appropriate parenting or acceptable behavior. She explained that the school had a zero-tolerance policy for bullying based on family structure, and that Aiden's comments fell directly under that policy. The face of Melissa turned red, but she pressed her lips together and didn't interrupt again. Paul surprised everyone by speaking up quietly. He said maybe they had been too harsh in their comments about Jamie and single-parent families. Melissa's head whipped around to stare at him with fury in her eyes, but he kept talking. He said the party incident had gotten out of hand, and that he'd been thinking about how their words might have affected Jamie. He admitted that they probably shouldn't have said those things in front of the kids. Melissa looked like she wanted to argue, but the principal was watching her carefully, and she seemed to realize this wasn't the time or place. The principal laid out the consequences clearly. Aiden had to apologize to Jamie in writing and in person. He would attend 3 mandatory sessions with the school counselor about respectful behavior and the impact of bullying. The principal also strongly suggested that both families consider whether the boys should have contact outside of school, given the ongoing tension between the adults. She said sometimes separation was healthier than forcing relationships that caused stress for the children involved. I felt relief wash through me because someone in authority was finally acknowledging that keeping Jamie away from Melissa and Aiden wasn't me being difficult, but protecting my son. After the meeting, I sat in my car for 10 minutes before driving home. Juliet had given me information about a support group for military widows that met on Thursday evenings at the community center. I'd been putting off going because the idea of sitting in a room talking about my dead husband with strangers felt overwhelming. But after everything with Melissa and now this school meeting, I realized I needed to connect with people who actually understood what I was going through. Thursday evening, I dropped Jamie at Michaela's house and drove to the community center with my stomach in knots. I walked into a room with 8 other women sitting in a circle of folding chairs. They all turned to look at me and smiled in a way that felt genuinely welcoming rather than pitying. A man named Arjun was leading the group even though he wasn't a widow himself. His wife had died in combat 5 years ago, and he'd been raising their daughter alone ever since. He invited me to sit down and introduce myself if I felt comfortable. I told them about my husband dying in Afghanistan 3 years ago, and about raising Jamie by myself. Then I mentioned the birthday party incident because it was still so raw and painful. Several women nodded like they'd heard similar stories before. Arjun shared that his teenage daughter was thriving despite predictions from his wife's family that she would struggle without her mother. He said his mother-in-law had told him repeatedly that girls needed their mothers, and that he couldn't possibly understand what his daughter needed. But his daughter was now a straight-A student who played varsity soccer and had been accepted to her first-choice college. His story gave me hope that Jamie would be okay too. The other women started sharing their own experiences with family members who undermined their parenting. One woman's brother had tried to get custody of her kids, claiming she was too unstable to raise them alone. Another woman's in-laws constantly criticized her choices and told her children that their father would be disappointed in how she was raising them. A third woman had cut off all contact with her late husband's family after they staged what they called an intervention about her parenting style. I listened to their stories and realized I wasn't alone in facing this kind of judgment. Several of them had eventually cut off contact with relatives who constantly criticized their choices or predicted doom for their children. They talked about how hard that decision had been, but how much better their kids did without the constant negativity. One woman named Sarah, who'd lost her husband in a training accident 6 years ago, reached across the circle and squeezed my hand. She told me her late husband's brother had tried to get custody of her 2 boys, claiming she was too unstable after the funeral. The courts dismissed it immediately, but the accusation alone damaged her relationship with that entire side of the family. She cut them off completely, and her sons were thriving now without relatives who questioned whether their mother was capable. Another woman shared that her mother-in-law still sent birthday cards to her kids with notes about how much their father would have loved to see them if only their mother had been more supportive of his career. The poison was constant and subtle, and it took years before she realized protecting her children meant cutting contact entirely. Listening to these stories made me understand that what Melissa did at the party wasn't just one bad moment. It was part of a pattern that would continue unless I stopped it. The group encouraged me to set firm boundaries and explained that keeping peace with family who undermined my parenting wasn't worth sacrificing Jamie's emotional health. They reminded me that my first responsibility was to my son, not to relatives who made him feel damaged or destined to fail. I left that meeting feeling stronger than I had in months. I wasn't overreacting or being too sensitive. I was protecting my child from people who wanted to predict his failure. Jamie came home from the school the next day and dropped his backpack by the door with a heavy thud. He walked into the kitchen where I was making dinner and told me Aiden had apologized during lunch. I asked him how it went, and Jamie shrugged while grabbing an apple from the counter. He said it seemed fake, like Aiden's mom had made him do it. The words sounded rehearsed, and Aiden wouldn't look at him while saying sorry. I sat down at the kitchen table, and Jamie joined me, still holding his apple. I told him he was probably right that Melissa had forced the apology, but at least now Aiden had to stop the bullying behavior at the school because the principal and teachers were watching. Jamie nodded and took a bite of his apple. He asked if Aiden would really stop being mean, or if he'd just get sneakier about it. I admitted I didn't know, but that the important thing was Jamie had adults at the school who believed him and were paying attention now. That seemed to satisfy him, and he went to his room to start his homework. My phone buzzed an hour later with a text from Melissa. The message was long and started with her saying the school was completely overreacting to normal boy behavior. She wrote that boys need to learn to handle teasing without adults interfering in every little conflict. According to her, I was raising Jamie to be soft and unable to deal with the real world. She claimed this was exactly why he needed male influence in his life, because I was coddling him instead of teaching him to be tough. The text went on for 3 more paragraphs about how boys in her generation handled their problems without running to teachers and counselors. She said Aiden was punished for something that should have been resolved between the kids themselves. I stared at my phone, reading her words over and over. She truly believed that her son calling mine a future criminal was just boys being boys. She thought teaching Jamie to stand up to bullying was making him weak. I wanted to respond with everything I was thinking, but I remembered what the support group had said about not engaging with people who refused to see reason. Instead, I called my mom that evening after Jamie went to bed. I told her I'd decided to take a break from family gatherings where Melissa would be present. My mom didn't even hesitate before saying she supported that decision completely. She said she'd handle any pushback from other relatives and that my only job was to take care of Jamie. I felt relief wash through me because I'd been worried she might try to keep the peace or suggest I was overreacting. But she understood that this wasn't about holding grudges or being petty. This was about protecting my son from someone who actively hurt him. My mom asked if I wanted her to talk to Melissa directly, and I said no. Nothing she could say would change Melissa's mind, and I didn't want to create more drama. I just wanted space and distance until Melissa could acknowledge the harm she'd caused. My mom said that was fair and reasonable, and that she'd make sure other family members understood my position. 2 days later, my mom called to tell me about Thanksgiving plans. She said she was offering to host 2 separate celebrations, so Jamie and I wouldn't have to see Melissa and Paul. One gathering would be on Thanksgiving Day with us and the relatives who understood our situation. The other would be the day after with Melissa's family and whoever wanted to attend that one. My mom said some family members were annoyed by the arrangement because it seemed like too much work, but she stood firm and told them this was how it had to be if they wanted to see everyone. A few relatives called her dramatic and said I needed to get over what happened at the party. My mom shut that down immediately by asking if they'd be okay with someone telling their child they'd end up in prison. That usually ended the conversation pretty quickly. I thanked her for going through all this trouble, and she said it wasn't trouble at all. She said Jamie was her grandson, and she'd do whatever it took to make sure he felt safe and loved at family events. Jamie's counseling sessions with Juliet continued every week, and I could see the difference in him. He smiled more easily and didn't flinch when kids at the school talked about their dads. One afternoon, Juliet asked to speak with me after Jamie's session. She said he was making real progress processing his grief about his dad and separating that loss from what Melissa had said at the party. Jamie was starting to understand that his aunt's cruel words weren't truth, but rather her own issues projected onto him. Juliet explained that kids often internalize criticism from adults, especially family members. But Jamie was learning to recognize when someone's opinion of him didn't match reality. She said he'd talked about wanting to make his dad proud by being a good person, and that his goals for himself had nothing to do with Melissa's predictions. I felt tears in my eyes listening to Juliet describe how strong my son was becoming. She told me I was doing everything right by maintaining boundaries and getting him proper support. The combination of counseling and a stable home environment was exactly what he needed. Work called me into a meeting the following week, and I spent the entire morning worried they were going to fire me. I'd been taking time off for Jamie's counseling appointments and school meetings, but instead my manager told me I was getting a promotion with a modest raise. They'd noticed how well I handled multiple responsibilities and wanted to give me a team lead position with slightly more flexible hours. The raise wasn't huge, but it would help with expenses and reduce some of the financial stress I'd been carrying since my husband died. I thanked my manager and walked back to my desk, trying not to cry from relief. For once, something good was happening without me having to fight for it. The extra money meant I could afford Jamie's counseling without worrying about the co-pays. It also meant I could save a little bit each month instead of living paycheck to paycheck. I called my mom during lunch to tell her the news, and she said she was proud of me. She reminded me that I was doing an amazing job balancing everything, and that this promotion proved other people recognized that too. Michaela texted me that weekend asking if I wanted to meet for coffee while the kids were at the school. We'd been friendly since the party, but hadn't spent much time together outside of kid-related events. I met her at a coffee shop near Jamie's school on Monday morning. We ordered our drinks and sat by the window watching people walk past on the sidewalk. Michaela asked how I was holding up with everything, and I gave her the honest version instead of the polite version. I told her about the counseling and the family drama and the promotion at work. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me her own mother had been a single parent after her dad left when she was 7. Her mom had raised 3 kids alone while working 2 jobs, and Michaela turned out just fine. She said watching me parent Jamie reminded her of her mom's strength and determination. I felt tears sliding down my cheeks right there in the coffee shop. Michaela handed me a napkin and said she meant every word. She told me that people like Melissa who predicted failure for single-parent families were usually dealing with their own insecurities. Happy people didn't go around trying to tear down others. We sat there for another hour talking about everything from parenting struggles to work stress, to how hard it was to make genuine friends as adults. By the time we left, I realized I'd made a real friend, not just another school parent acquaintance. Jamie came to me the next evening while I was folding laundry in the living room. He asked if he could invite his friend Tyler to go to the arcade instead of attending a family gathering that weekend. I asked which gathering he meant, and he said the one at his uncle's house where Melissa might show up. My heart broke a little, realizing he was already thinking strategically about avoiding his aunt. But I was also proud that he was learning to advocate for his own boundaries and emotional safety. I told him yes, he could absolutely invite Tyler, and that I thought it was smart of him to prioritize spending time with people who made him feel good. Jamie smiled and ran off to call Tyler. I sat there with a pile of unfolded towels in my lap thinking about how much he'd grown in just a few weeks. He was learning to protect himself in healthy ways instead of just enduring situations that hurt him. That was exactly what I wanted to teach him, even though I wished the lesson hadn't come from such a painful experience. My mom called me 2 days later, sounding tired and frustrated. She said Melissa had been calling relatives complaining that I was keeping Jamie away from family and turning him against his cousins. Several family members had reached out to my mom asking what was really going on. My mom told them the truth about what Melissa said at the party and how she'd doubled down instead of apologizing. Some relatives were shocked because Melissa had told them I'd overreacted to innocent comments. Others admitted they'd always found Melissa judgmental, but never said anything to keep the peace. My mom said she was handling it, but wanted me to know that Melissa was actively trying to make me look like the bad guy. I thanked her for the warning and told her I wasn't surprised. People who couldn't acknowledge their own behavior always tried to control the narrative by painting themselves as victims. My mom agreed and said she'd keep me updated if anything else came up. I spent that evening drafting an email to my extended family after Jamie fell asleep. I kept my tone calm and factual, explaining that I needed to protect my son from comments that damaged his self-esteem and mental health. I didn't trash Melissa or go into every horrible thing she'd said. I simply stated that her behavior at the party crossed a line I couldn't ignore and that I was putting Jamie's well-being first. I read it 3 times before sending it to my aunts, uncles, and older cousins who'd been asking questions. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute before I finally pressed it. The responses started coming in within hours. My Aunt Carol wrote back immediately saying she'd never liked how Melissa talked about Jamie and that she was glad I was finally standing up to her. My Aunt Susan sent a longer message sharing that Melissa had made similar judgmental comments about her daughter's learning disability and that she'd been biting her tongue for years. My Uncle Robert said he'd had his own issues with Melissa's judgmental attitude at family gatherings and completely understood my position. Only 2 relatives sent neutral responses that basically said they hoped everyone could work things out eventually. Nobody defended Melissa or suggested I was overreacting. The validation felt like someone had lifted a weight off my chest that I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. 3 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was my brother-in-law calling from his work phone. He asked if he could talk to me privately, and his voice sounded strained in a way I'd never heard before. He apologized for not standing up for Jamie at the party and said he'd been replaying that afternoon in his mind ever since. He admitted that Melissa had been increasingly critical and negative about many things lately, not just about Jamie and me. She'd been finding fault with their neighbors, his co-workers, even their own kids when they didn't meet her standards. He said he'd been avoiding confrontation because it was easier than dealing with her anger, but watching her destroy Jamie's birthday had shaken something loose in him. He knew he should have stopped her, and he was sorry he didn't. His apology sounded genuine, and I could hear real regret in his voice. I thanked him for calling and told him I appreciated his honesty. But I also made it clear that until Melissa could genuinely acknowledge the harm she'd caused, I needed to keep distance between her and Jamie. I wasn't trying to punish anyone or create drama in the family. I was simply protecting my son from someone who predicted his failure and treated him like he was damaged goods. My brother-in-law said he understood completely and that he was working on addressing issues in his own marriage. He asked me not to mention the call to Melissa because she'd be furious if she knew he'd reached out. I agreed to keep it between us, and we ended the conversation on surprisingly good terms. The holidays approached faster than I expected. My mom called to confirm the separate gathering she'd arranged so Jamie and I wouldn't have to see Melissa and her family. Some relatives grumbled about the inconvenience of 2 celebrations, but my mom held firm. She told anyone who complained that they were welcome to attend whichever gathering they preferred, but she wasn't forcing her grandson to spend the holidays walking on eggshells. Jamie and I showed up to my mom's house for our celebration and found a relaxed atmosphere with aunts, uncles, and cousins who actually wanted to be there. Nobody made comments about Jamie's future or questioned my parenting. Jamie played video games with his cousins and ate 3 pieces of pie without anyone criticizing his manners or suggesting he lacked discipline. I watched him laugh at something his cousin said and realized I hadn't seen him this relaxed at a family gathering in years. The absence of Melissa's judgment and Aiden's bullying made everything lighter and easier. My mom pulled me aside while we were cleaning up after dinner and told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything. She said some family members needed to learn that actions had consequences and that protecting Jamie was always the right choice. January arrived with freezing temperatures and a fresh start. I met with the school counselor for an update on Jamie's progress. She told me he'd made significant improvements in their sessions and that his confidence had noticeably increased. She said he was participating more in class, standing up for himself when other kids teased him, and generally seemed more secure in who he was. She credited the stable, supportive environment I'd created at home and the consistent boundaries I'd maintained with toxic family members. Hearing a professional validate my choices made me tear up right there in her office. She handed me a tissue and said she wished more parents prioritized their children's emotional health the way I did. She recommended we continue the weekly sessions through the end of the school year to maintain his progress and give him tools for handling future challenges. Jamie came home from the school the next week, buzzing with excitement about soccer team tryouts. He'd never shown much interest in team sports before, but several of his friends were trying out and he wanted to join them. I drove him to the tryouts and watched from the sidelines as he ran drills and practiced with about 30 other kids. He wasn't the most skilled player, but he gave it everything he had and never stopped trying. When the coach posted the team roster 2 days later, Jamie's name was on it. He ran to the car after school waving the permission slip and talking a mile a minute about practice schedules and game days. Over the next few weeks, I met the other soccer parents at practices and games. Several of them were also raising kids alone after divorce or death. We formed a casual support network, carpooling to away games and cheering loudly from the bleachers. One mom told me her ex-husband had said similar things to what Melissa said, predicting their son would fail without a father in the home. Her son was now team captain and honor roll student. We laughed about how wrong these doom predictions turned out to be. I heard through my Aunt Carol that Melissa and her husband were having serious marital problems. Apparently, he'd moved out temporarily, and they were living separately while trying to figure things out. My aunt didn't know all the details, but said the stress in their household had been building for months. I didn't wish them harm or take pleasure in their struggles, but I did feel a sense of validation that their supposedly perfect family wasn't so perfect after all. The people who spent so much energy judging others often had plenty of problems they were hiding or ignoring. I hoped they'd work through their issues for their kids' sake, but I also recognized that their problems weren't my responsibility to fix or worry about. The next support group meeting brought unexpected news. One of the regular members asked if Jamie might be interested in joining a mentorship program that connected kids who'd lost military parents with veterans who volunteered their time. The program matched kids with mentors based on shared interests and personalities, creating positive male role models for children growing up without fathers. I told him I'd ask Jamie about it and see if he was interested. That evening, I explained the program to Jamie over dinner. His eyes lit up immediately, and he asked if he could really meet a veteran who knew what it was like to lose a parent in the military. I told him yes, and that we'd fill out the application together. He finished his homework faster than usual that night and kept asking when he'd find out about his mentor match. 2 weeks later, we got the call that Jamie had been matched with a retired Marine who lived about 20 minutes away. His name was Daniel Rivera, and he'd grown up without a father after his dad died in Vietnam. He'd joined the Marines at 18 and served for 20 years before retiring and starting a career as a high school history teacher. The program coordinator said Daniel loved sports and video games, which made him a perfect match for Jamie's interests. We arranged to meet Daniel at a local park the following Saturday. Jamie was nervous on the drive over, asking me questions about what he should say and whether Daniel would like him. I told him to just be himself, and that Daniel had volunteered for this program because he wanted to help kids like Jamie. When we arrived at the park, Daniel was waiting by the basketball courts wearing jeans and a Marine sweatshirt. He was in his early 50s with gray at his temples and an easy smile that immediately put Jamie at ease. They shook hands, and Daniel suggested they shoot some baskets while I sat on a nearby bench. I watched them talk and laugh as they played, and Jamie's nervous energy transformed into genuine excitement. After an hour, Daniel walked Jamie back over to me, and they made plans to meet again the following week. On the drive home, Jamie talked nonstop about their conversation. He told me Daniel understood what it felt like to miss a dad you barely remembered. He said Daniel played the same video games he did, and promised to show him some strategies next time they met. He asked if Daniel could come to one of his soccer games, and I told him we'd have to check with the program coordinator, but probably yes. I glanced at Jamie in the rearview mirror and saw him smiling out the window, and I knew introducing him to this program was one of the best decisions I'd made since the birthday party disaster. Over the next few weeks, Jamie's sessions with his mentor became the highlight of his week. He'd come home talking about the video game strategies they practiced or the basketball moves they worked on at the park. I watched my son slowly transform back into the confident kid he'd been before the party, maybe even more secure than before. One evening after dinner, he looked up from his homework and said he didn't think about what Melissa said at the party very much anymore. His counselor had helped him understand that mean people sometimes say mean things that aren't true, and that those words said more about them than about him. I hugged him tight and told him how proud I was of how strong he'd become. He shrugged like it was no big deal and went back to his math problems, but I saw the small smile on his face. 3 months after the party, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. The message was short and said she was sorry for what she said at Jamie's birthday, and that she'd been going through personal stress that she took out on him. She wrote that she knew her words were hurtful, and that she hoped we could move forward eventually. I stared at the screen for a long time trying to decide how to respond. The apology felt incomplete, like she was checking a box rather than truly understanding the damage she'd caused. But it was more than I'd expected from someone who'd spent months justifying her behavior to anyone who would listen. I showed the text to my mom, who said it was a start, even if it wasn't perfect. That evening, I wrote back thanking Melissa for the apology, but explaining that rebuilding trust would take time, and that Jamie's well-being was my priority. I left the door open for future contact, but made clear that boundaries would remain firm, and that any relationship moving forward would need to be on different terms than before. A week later, my brother-in-law called to tell me that he and Melissa were attending marriage counseling. He sounded tired but hopeful as he explained that their therapist had addressed Melissa's pattern of critical behavior toward others and how it was affecting their marriage and kids. The therapist apparently asked Melissa why she felt the need to tear down other people's parenting choices and what insecurities were driving that behavior. My brother-in-law said he hoped things would improve, but acknowledged the damage that had been done, not just to Jamie and me, but to their own family. He apologized again for not standing up for us at the party and said he was working on being less passive when Melissa crossed lines. I told him I appreciated the call and that I genuinely hoped their counseling helped them build a healthier relationship. After we hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, like maybe this whole terrible situation had forced everyone to confront problems that had been festering for years. Spring came, and with it, Jamie's school concert. I sat in the auditorium waiting for the performance to start when I noticed Melissa and my brother-in-law sitting several rows behind me. We made eye contact and exchanged polite nods but didn't speak or move closer. Jamie performed a solo on his recorder, looking confident and focused on the stage. When the concert ended, he ran straight to me, beaming with pride, not even glancing in their direction. I hugged him and told him he was amazing, and we left through the side door to avoid any awkward conversations. On the drive home, Jamie asked if I'd seen his aunt and uncle there. I said yes, and he nodded but didn't ask any follow-up questions, like their presence didn't matter much to him anymore. The school year ended with an awards ceremony where Jamie received recognition for most improved attitude and effort. His teacher pulled me aside afterward and said that whatever I was doing at home was working. She told me Jamie had become a leader in the classroom, helping other kids with their work, and standing up for students who were being picked on. She said she'd taught for 15 years and rarely saw a kid make such a positive transformation in a single school year. I thanked her and told her about the counseling and the mentor program and the support group that had helped me become a better parent. She squeezed my arm and said I was giving myself too little credit, that plenty of kids had resources, but not all of them had a mom who fought this hard for them. That evening, Jamie asked if we could do something different for his 10th birthday coming up in a few months. Instead of a big party, he wanted to invite just his mentor and Michaela's family to a small celebration. He said he'd rather hang out with people who actually cared about him than try to impress a bunch of kids from the school. I loved that he was choosing quality over quantity and surrounding himself with people who truly supported him. We started planning a backyard barbecue with games and his favorite foods. Nothing fancy, but exactly what he wanted. The birthday celebration in July was everything the Chuck E. Cheese party wasn't. The weather was perfect, and we set up tables in our small backyard with decorations Jamie had helped pick out. His mentor arrived first, and immediately started tossing a football with Jamie while I finished preparing food. Michaela's family showed up with a homemade cake, and her kids ran straight to Jamie for a group hug. My mom drove in from out of state and spent the afternoon taking pictures and telling embarrassing stories about me as a kid. We played cornhole and ate too much food and sang happy birthday while Jamie blew out his candles looking genuinely happy. No drama, no cruel comments, no parents judging each other. Just people who loved my son celebrating another year of his life. After everyone left, my mom helped me clean up the backyard. She told me she was proud of how I'd handled this difficult situation over the past year and that my husband would be proud too. She said protecting Jamie while staying open to eventual reconciliation with Melissa showed real strength and maturity. I told her there were plenty of days I didn't feel strong or mature, days when I questioned every decision I made. She laughed and said that was just called being a parent, that doubt was normal, but results were what mattered. Looking at Jamie playing with the new soccer ball his mentor had given him, I had to admit the results were pretty good. A few days after the party, a card arrived in the mail addressed to Jamie. Inside was a genuine apology from Melissa written in her neat handwriting, acknowledging that what she'd said at his 9th birthday was cruel and unfair. She wrote that she hoped he was having a wonderful 10th birthday, and that she was working on being a better person. Tucked inside was a gift card to his favorite store. Jamie read the card at the kitchen table and said that was nice, then put it in his desk drawer and went outside to practice soccer. He didn't seem to need anything more from her right now. Didn't seem angry or hurt, just neutral and focused on his own life. I realized that was probably the healthiest response possible. Summer turned into fall, and I started noticing things about Jamie that made me stop and really see what was happening. He'd come home from the school talking about his day without that heavy sadness that used to follow him around everywhere. His shoulders didn't slump anymore when other kids talked about their dads. He'd made friends with 3 boys in his class who invited him to their houses on weekends and actually wanted him there. One afternoon, I picked him up from soccer practice, and his coach pulled me aside to say Jamie had natural leadership skills, and the other kids looked up to him. I drove home thinking about how Melissa's statistics never measured things like having a mom who showed up to every game, or a support group that taught me how to talk about grief, or a counselor who helped my son process his feelings instead of burying them. The numbers she'd thrown around at that party assumed single mothers were all struggling and overwhelmed and doing a bad job. They didn't account for the work I put in every single day to make sure Jamie felt loved and supported and safe. The first day of 5th grade, Jamie put on his new backpack and told me he wanted to join the school debate team. He said his mentor had told him that being able to argue your point was an important skill no matter what job you ended up doing. We talked about his future sometimes now without it feeling sad or scary. Some days he said he wanted to join the military like his dad and serve his country. Other days he talked about becoming a teacher because he liked helping younger kids with their homework. Last week he'd announced he might want to be a veterinarian after we'd taken a neighbor's dog to the emergency clinic, and he'd been fascinated by everything the vet did. The possibilities felt wide open instead of narrow and predetermined. He wasn't heading toward some dark, inevitable future that Melissa had predicted. He was just a regular kid figuring out who he wanted to be. My phone buzzed one evening in October with a text from Paul asking if we could talk. I almost deleted it, but something made me call him back. He answered on the first ring and said he'd been thinking a lot about Jamie and Aiden and how the boys used to be close before everything fell apart. He admitted that Aiden had been struggling with his own issues and that their family therapist said Aiden needed better role models and healthier relationships. Paul said he'd noticed how well Jamie was doing, how confident and happy he seemed at the few family events where they'd crossed paths. He asked if maybe the boys could spend some supervised time together once Aiden finished more counseling work and learned better ways to treat people. I told him I'd think about it and talk to Jamie. I wasn't ready to just let Aiden back into our lives, but I also wasn't going to slam the door completely shut if real change was happening. A year had passed since that horrible party at the arcade, and I barely recognized our lives compared to where we'd been. Jamie brought home a report card with straight A's, and his teacher's note said he was one of her most engaged students. I'd built real friendships with other parents from the school and the support group. We had people we could call when we needed help or just wanted company. My mom visited more often and stopped worrying about me constantly. Michaela and her family had become like extended family to us. Jamie's mentor took him to baseball games and taught him how to change a tire and listened when he needed to talk about his dad. We'd proven that families could look a million different ways, and what mattered wasn't the structure, but the love and stability and protection from people who tried to tear you down. Life wasn't perfect, and some days were still hard, but we were genuinely happy, and that felt like everything.